Water shapes our world. Life as we know it cannot exist without water, at least not for an extended period of time. And yet too much water can be an impediment to survival as well. Water management is critical to sustainable, healthy landscapes, particularly in an increasingly challenging environment. Ben Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail." Well, the same is true of water management. Poor water management leads to declining landscapes, higher expenses, and potentially lost business. But don't worry, our experts are here to help.
Hi, I'm Mark Jackson, Water Management Consultant for the Davey Institute. In this 5-part series, Water Specialists will share with you how water impacts the landscapes that we care for. Join us and discover water use efficiency methods that will help improve your landscape while actually using less water. Welcome back to our final session of our 5-part series on water stewardship. Today, turf specialist from the Davey Institute, Zane Raudenbush, will be speaking on managing Flora to promote drought tolerance and how drought-tolerant plants are not just born, they are made. Let's join Zane and see what the plants really need.
Hello, I'm Dr. Zane Raudenbush, Turfgrass and Herbicide Specialist here at the Davey Institute. Today I'll be delivering the last part of our 5-part series on water management in the landscape. Today I'm excited to talk to you about how to promote drought-tolerant plants in the landscape. So the concept that through our management practices throughout the growing season, we can actually improve a plant's ability to withstand drought throughout the growing season. And so it's really this idea that drought-tolerant plants are not just born, but rather through our management they are made. Before we dive into the specific management practices, I think it's important to have some perspective about what is drought. So drought really, by definition, is when the plants start to reach some type of soil water deficit. And so plants will experience a lot of different stresses in the growing environment. Insects, fungi, different diseases, whatever it might be, but without question, drought is the most frequent stress that plants will experience out there in the landscape. And so if you watched my colleagues, Mark Jackson and Dr. Chris Fields Johnson, they spoke about the importance of the soil. And so the soil by volume is 50% soil particles, sand, silt, and clay, and the other 50% of that volume is pore space, which hopefully is occupied by air and water. And so plants, as they are growing in the environment, they're extracting that water from the root zone via its roots. It's moved up through the vascular tissue and eventually evaporated. Most of that water is evaporated off of the leaf surface through the process of transpiration. And so plants, the amount of water that they may extract from the soil is dictated by the season. So during the cooler periods, plants are not extracting a lot of water from the soil. But during the summer months, like we have right now here in Kent, Ohio, when the temperature is high and there's a high amount of solar radiation, we'll see that plants can use a lot more water. And so they draw down the amount of water in the soil profile till eventually they may reach the permanent wilting point where they can no longer extract any more water from the soil. So promoting drought tolerance is really about trying to get plants to extract a greater amount of water from the soil or conserve that water more consistently. The first concept I'd like to discuss as it relates to promoting drought-tolerant plants in the landscape is to know your soil. It's very easy to forget that the soil is there, that it's ultimately sustaining the life of our plants because it's underneath our feet. How often do you really look at the soil that you're growing your plants in? And so I encourage you to take a really active approach to know your soil. And so how do we do that? You need to make a small investment in a tool called a soil probe. And so through that, you're able to go around the landscape, insert that soil probe into planting beds, turf grass areas, whatever it might be, and physically look at the soil. Look to see if there's layering. Look at the color. Look at how it feels in your hands. And then also to send that away. You can have soil tests performed for a relatively cheap price that are going to tell you all kinds of things about your soil. And so it's so important to know your soil. Here in Ohio, I know that we have, in this particular area, heavy clay soils. So these are soils that inherently do not infiltrate a lot of water, highly susceptible to compaction. And so knowing that, I can change certain management strategies about the frequency with which we might water, the the ability of root zone that we might try to influence as we plant plants, knowing that they're going to have a harder time penetrating through the soil profile to ultimately develop that nice, thick, extensive root system that we need to promote drought-tolerant plants. And so if you don't own a soil probe, I would encourage you to make the small investment and go purchase one and use it. Throughout your landscape, go around and pull soil samples, because if there's one thing we know about the urban environment, it's that the soil is not consistent. So when we think about coming in and constructing buildings and parking lots and islands, those soils have been disturbed. And we find that there can be big discrepancies between the different soil types within the same property. And so without getting that soil probe out and looking at the soil, you simply don't know how to influence your management practices. So purchase a soil probe and get to know your soil. The second concept to promote drought-tolerant plants in the landscape is to make data-driven decisions. And so using data to influence the management decisions that you make throughout the growing season to ultimately promote drought-tolerant plants. And so the three pieces of data that I look at most frequently is the weather forecast, the soil moisture, and the information I've got from conducting some type of irrigation audit. And so the weather forecast is the easiest. We can get it on our cell phones, our computers, but you should be looking at the weather forecast all the time, understanding when is precipitation scheduled in the forecast, what is the temperature and the cloud cover likely to be. Through this type of data, we can forecast into the future how much water are plants likely to use and how much stress may they experience, or when is Mother Nature potentially going to provide some much needed precipitation. And so if you're not looking at the forecast, there's a high possibility that you're going to be wasting water and potentially over-irrigating your plants. We often see that irrigation cycles that are scheduled when there's a high degree or high possibility of precipitation in the forecast, that we could start to remove irrigation cycles throughout the week, throughout the month, and really make a pretty significant decrease in the total amount of water that we use on the property. And we're also promoting drought tolerance. Remember that plants are mining, their roots are mining, going deeper into the soil profile, looking for water as the soil begins to dry down. And so if we're constantly supplying water up at the surface, those plants don't have to go far. They really establish a small root system up near the surface of the soil profile. They don't mine deep into the soil and develop this really extensive root system. And so plants with a small root system, we'll see under just small little periods of drought that they begin to wilt and experience stress symptoms much earlier than plants that have been watered properly and have a really well developed root system. So be sure you're looking at the forecast. The second is to know what the real-time soil moisture is. And so, Mark Jackson and myself, we have expensive soil moisture meters that can give us the real-time volumetric water content of the soil, but there are cheap meters that you can get for $15 to $20 that can give you some idea about what's going on in the soil profile. And if you don't own one of those devices, then use the soil probe. Use your soil probe and begin to feel the soil in your hands. If it's brittle and falls apart, there's probably a high degree that it's going to be very dry and the plants are going to begin to exhibit some type of drought symptoms. But if the soil is soft, you can see that there's adequate moisture, those are going to be things that you can use to influence whether or not you decide to irrigate or go around and supplement water, whatever it might be. So be sure that you understand what the real-time soil moisture is on your particular property. And then the last is to conduct an irrigation audit. So irrigation audits can be extensive in terms of setting up hundreds of cups across the landscape to determine what the real-time precipitation rate is, but it can be much simpler than that. Using some type of simple catch device and moved around throughout the various days, you can begin to understand how much water is the irrigation system putting out over a certain period of time and throughout the different zones. If you remember from Mark Jackson's video, he talked about the relationship between soil infiltration, so how much water can the soil absorb in a given time versus what the irrigation system can supply. Now here in Ohio and our clay soils, we know that many of our soil infiltration rates are quite low, close to a 1/4 inch of water per hour. And several of our irrigation zones are capable of putting out 1 inch to 2 inches of water per hour. So understanding that the soil can't infiltrate as much water as you can put down is an important piece. And we also know that the different zones, so as we design irrigation systems, some of the zones can put out a lot more water than others. And so you need to be aware of that so you can go in and influence and make strategic decisions about how much run time for the various stations. right? If without that audit data, you really are guessing. And so checking the weather forecast, knowing what the real-time soil moisture is, and understanding how much water your irrigation system puts out are data-driven decisions that are going to help you promote drought-tolerant plants in the landscape. The third concept I'd like to discuss as it relates to promoting drought-tolerant plants involves the actual irrigation system itself. Too often we see on properties that people implement what we call the set it and forget it style of irrigation scheduling, where sometime in the beginning of the growing season, somebody goes in and sets the run times in the irrigation clock to run a set number of days per week. They shut the box and they don't touch it. Okay? We know that plant water use throughout the growing season is not stagnant, right? That we use less water in the cooler months and we use a lot more water in the landscape during the summer months. And so, irrigating properly is a holistic approach where you're constantly making small manipulations to the system. You're using the day that you got out there in the field to inform that, hey, that landscape bed, which is station number 3, there was adequate moisture in that bed when I checked it today. I'm going to turn that station off. But the turf grass, where I did take the soil moisture data, is dry. So we're going to continue to run that. So you're going to be making manipulations to the scheduling and the frequency and the quantity throughout the growing season. That is ultimately how you promote plants to mine for that water in the root zone. The set it and forget it mentality, time and time again, results in overwatering plant material. There's a saying in the irrigation world that you can always put more down, but once you put it down, you can't take it away. And so we, as a general rule of thumb, would much rather have you in a position where you can put more irrigation down, slightly underwatering, than seeing you overwatering that plant material, which just leads to a whole nother set of issues. And so I hope that you found this series helpful. I would like to tip my hat to you and recognize that you've made a good use of your time. Life on our planet would not be possible without water. It's important that we be stewards and conserve this vital resource. And through that, you're also going to find that your plant material is going to look more vibrant and have greater vitality throughout the drought-stricken periods. So thank you for watching this video series. Have a good day.